why closing ratios aren't much higher than they are. I think industry-wide, they range between 20 and 33%, I think is the average close ratio across the board in B2B. Why isn't it higher than that? I'll be honest with you. When I was a field rep, my close ratio was somewhere around 80%. And that's because I just refused to work with anybody that it wasn't going to be a good use of my time.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman podcast, and welcome to today's show. On today's show we have James Muir, who is an expert on closing the sale, and that is exactly what we're talking about today. We're talking about the perfect close, which is the name of James's book, which you can find on Amazon. And yeah, it's super easy to implement, it's super easy and practical to understand. I think there's a lot of value in this episode for you guys, Sales Nation. Everything we talk about is available in the show notes over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with all that said, let's jump in. James, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Will, it's great to be on your show.
I'm glad to have you on, mate. We're going to dive into a topic that 300 episodes in, 250 odd, 260 published. I don't think we've done an episode on the close yet somehow. So that just came to mind as I was kind of like teeing things up here. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of value in this one. There's a lot of angles to go at. Hopefully you can touch on the psychology of some of this as well. But I want to start things off by offering you an open-ended question to see, to not put words in your mouth and to see where we go with it. But do you feel like, or do you know that salespeople in the B2B world, are they closing enough of the qualified buyers that are in front of them? Enough of the people that they've put blood, sweat, tears, and arguments at home because they're on the phone at 9 p.m. every evening calling customers, that they've put all this effort into? Are salespeople closing enough of these qualified prospects?
Well, the short answer would be no, but there's two parts to your question. You said qualified, and then are they closing them? So we know statistically they're not closing them, but qualified is a big component of that. I mean, how you ask for an advance or how you ask for a commitment to keep the momentum going to close, that's what the book is all about. But if I had to step back and managing my own people, you're really much better spending a lot of energy in targeting the right accounts. So that qualified part of your question is a really big component of why closing ratios aren't much higher than they are. I think industry-wide, they range between 20 and 33%, I think is the average close ratio across the board in B2B. But why isn't it higher than that? I'll be honest with you. When I was a field rep, my close ratio was somewhere around 80%. And that's because I just refused to work with anybody that it wasn't going to be a good use of my time. So these ratios are low because I think people spend a lot of energy working on accounts that really could never close to begin with.
Okay, so let's stop on this. And perhaps we can go step by step as best we can. Why do we spend time communicating? And it is effort. I talk about it on the show to talk bigger picture. You never, whether you're doing it in sales or in your life in general, if you're trying to communicate and influence someone and progress a decision along, you never get that time back. It's gone. It's forever. It's spent. It's done. We're all getting older. We're all getting that step closer to being in a box to get kind of morbid about it. But when we think about it from that perspective, why do we still spend so much time trying to get someone who's never going to close? Because then we're using weird manipulation tactics and all kinds of stuff like that. So why do we spend so much time with unqualified buyers?
Well, if I had to boil it down to two words, I would say it's irrational hope. That's what it is. I mean, and I think maybe you could add into that as a whole, most sales reps don't really like doing business development / lead generation. It's not the top thing that they like to do. So when you get right down to it, if you're in front of an unqualified one, people would rather hope and spend energy on a low probability one than to spend that time going after a high probability one. So there's a relationship there between those two things. And if they just got proficient at doing the business generation, the lead generation piece of it, it actually frees them up to only work with the most qualified ones. And so it ends up winning on both sides. But the truth is they should dump the low probability ones and then just go out and find one. But it takes quite a bit of willpower for reps to do that.
Definitely. Okay, so I want to end the kind of conversation there on lead gen, because we can talk about that all day. We can talk about qualifying all day as well. Is there a so I want to talk about the close. For anyone listening, I'm doing like kind of inverted finger commas as I say that. Is the close a process? Is it a step-by-step thing? Is it the next step that happens, or is it something that should happen seamlessly? And should we be, what I'm getting at here, James, is should we be setting it up along the way?
Well, I do think you need to set it up. So, in fact, just statistically, 50 to 90% of all sales encounters, right? It's a pretty big range there, but 50 to 90%, there's no commitment of any kind asked at all, of any kind. And so those statistics are horrid. Now, it varies depending on the industry, but the problem of not asking for any commitment at all is really a much bigger problem than asking in the wrong way. Just because, and if you ask me, hey, what's your opinion? Why do you think that is? What I would tell you is most of the traditional ways that people have learned how to close are manipulative, and so people don't feel comfortable asking. So what they do, and I've been on ride-alongs where I watch this happen. Here comes that moment where clearly it's the right thing to do is to advance the sale in some way, and they don't do anything, and it's because they don't feel comfortable with it. And so if people were comfortable with the approach they were using to help the customer out, to help advance it, then it'll happen. But I think when people have this perception that selling is about persuasion or manipulation or convincing people, it's really not. A better way to think about it is you've got a customer that's trying to get somewhere, right? Just imagine that you're an athlete and you're trying to achieve a certain physical goal. You would love to have a coach that would help you get to where you're trying to go at the pace that you're ready for. Well, that's the way to see sales. That's what you're doing. You are helping them get to where they're trying to go, and we're trying to advance that. But a coach also does push you just a little bit, right? But not in an overbearing sort of way. So that's really the way I think you should be looking at it, which means that we should plan a little bit in advance when we go have a conversation about what's the ideal outcome here for my client. Now, that doesn't mean the client's ready for that, but we should think about it. And then we might want to have a couple of alternatives to fall back on if it turns out they're not quite ready for those other two. So I definitely think that you should go into any encounter with a concept of maybe 3, maybe more, an ideal outcome, and then maybe a couple of alternatives just in case we haven't judged correctly on what the best outcome could be. With that in your pocket, you're still going to be present with the customer and try to help them move forward at a pace that's ready for them. And the perfect close is essentially asking in a way that is non-confrontational that helps figure out where that is. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, and it leads me to another angle on this. Which has to come first to put a perfect close into practice? Is it the process and the prep, or is it becoming comfortable? Which one is the bigger limiting factor? Can you have process and have practice and have alternative outcomes, and not being comfortable in asking still holds you back? Or do you have to the other way around? Do you have to be comfortable before you can put the process in place?
Both of those are absolutely critical, but the of those two, which is bigger, which is what you asked, absolutely it's that you're comfortable. You have to feel that you're helping a customer. If you feel like you're not, if at the worst case scenario, if you don't believe in your solution and you feel like you're actually screwing the customer by selling them a product, you're going to be telegraphing that all over the place when you are with a customer, and so you'll keep failing over and over and over again because the customers pick up. You send a whole ton of non-verbal signals, even verbally, but it's just in the tonality in your voice that tell the customer that you're not confident in it, and so that's a problem. So that has to happen first, right?
Well, let's stop on this, because this is something that I see all the time. I see salespeople email me, Sales Nation, the audience, they email me saying, "I'm in a bit of a rut. I'm doing, as a classic example of an email from our audience. I'm in a rut. I'm doing well. I'm hitting target. I hate the product or service. I hate my manager. I hate my life, and I want to change to do something else, but I feel like I'm kind of like locked in or tied down to the amount of money I'm making, and so making that change is 1, scary, and then 2, is difficult, and there's a barrier to entry of doing that, whether you've got to take you've had to save up 12 months money to be able to take that leap to change into a new career, new industry where you might not perform as well. You might not be the top salesperson while you build your industry knowledge, things of that nature. So where I'm going with this is it okay to not like your product but not be on to the depth that you think it's hurting people, and then try and convince yourself you like your product? Or do you need to genuinely, no BS, do you have to genuinely love what you're selling?
To the degree that you love what you're selling, you're going to be more successful. So that's the short answer. If you don't believe in your product or your solution, then start looking now for another place to be, because it will end. I mean, I know several people that are actually very successful, but they hate their jobs. So there's more to life than just money. And so there's a quality of life factor here. And if you're going to make it in sales as a career, yeah, you need to do stuff that you like. And that's, by the way, why you don't want to use shady tactics to try to succeed in sales, right? Or to try to earn money.
And what happens when we do use these weird tactics? Like, just to play devil's advocate for a second, if it closes deals, why shouldn't we do these things?
Oh, well, they backfire. I mean, every one of us has a customer that we wish we didn't get because the customer turned into a total nightmare. And a good percentage of those happen all during the sales cycle because there was either expectations set by the rep that couldn't be made or that couldn't be met. And the salesperson is a very big component of how that is set up. So never do that. Absolutely never. In fact, play more conservatively. You want to exceed their expectations when you get to the delivery stage, because if there's a shortcut in selling, it's not in these manipulative techniques, but it's in doing a great job for an existing client and then have that client help you get other clients. That's probably the fastest, the best shortcut in sales that there is. So instead of trying to take the shortcut at the beginning to get the original sale, what you want to do is take it a little slower, do a really great job for that client. That client will help get you other clients.
Definitely. So, okay, let's dive into the process perhaps a little bit more in the close. So we're assuming we've got a big, nice, fat pipeline so that we're not feeling pressured to close anyone or pressured to do anything weird to just hit target. So we can assume that. Maybe we can't assume that in most cases, but in this scenario, we will assume that. We will assume that we've pre-qualified the buyer the best we can. We feel like we can help them, and tell me if I'm wrong here, James, but this is what I see the close as: that little bit of friction that you've just got to push them over, in that they know that it's going to be a bit of disruption, they know that it's going to be a little bit of hard work, but the end result they're happy with. So I see the close as that just little nudge that you've got to give, that little bit of a push to just get them over this little bit of a lip so that they can get the results out the other end. I guess first off, is that how you would describe the close as well, or am I way off?
No, I probably wouldn't describe it the way you did, but actually you and I are essentially in alignment with that. I would just say it actually can be zero confrontation. I mean, it can be completely no confrontation, no pressure, no nothing. All it is you're trying to help. That's all you're trying to do. If you do it in the right way, then the way you ask will not feel like it hardly even feels like going over a bump, right? And hopefully we'll share that with your audience here in a minute. But so I think that's a big thing. In terms of the when to ask, you can use the force to tell you when that moment is. But you can also, I'm a very big fan of agendas. And so in the B2B world, it's very appropriate for you to create an agenda with your client. And what I would do is just put somewhere near the bottom of your agenda, next steps. And it's already built into the meeting that you're going to have. When you get to that one, you both have it on your list. All right, well, now let's talk about these next steps. And that's when you're going to use the perfect close. So it'll be very, very natural. Even if you're like obtuse to the force and you can't tell the right time to ask the question, you can still use it. And because it's non-confrontational, it will feel completely appropriate, because it's just that's the nature of the question. It doesn't create any conflict.
Well, I've got an example of this which happened today. So I have sponsors that come on the podcast, and I'm doing a bunch of live events and some secret things that the audience may know if they follow me on social media, but I'm not ready to promote on the show itself yet. But essentially, there's going to be a bunch of opportunities for the audience to meet me, and there's going to be some live kind of interviews and other stuff going on. And so I've been negotiating, going back and forth with a bunch of companies within the sales industry to put a sponsorship kind of package together so that all this content is brought to you by X or Y company. So I did this, as you just described, which is something I have to force myself to do as process, which is in the end of the proposal, whatever it is, or the end of the conversation or the email, I always go for the next step. And where we're at now is the next step was to put at the end of the email that went over to clarify our phone call was on X day, which is next week, we're going to have a phone call and we're going to like finalize the decision whether you're going to, come with us or not. And I'm doing this from a place of there's multiple companies that want to, or at least very interested in doing this. So I know one of them will come through just by the laws of probability as opposed to everything else, which is, back down to this concept of having a big full pipeline. So using that as a scenario, and you can educate me on this personally, that next conversation has been pre-framed, if we can use that phrase, to be, this is the time we're going to discuss yes, no, not maybe, but a best alternative, or however we want to describe it. How do I go into that conversation when I pick up the phone and not just say, hey, are we doing the deal? Are we doing the business? Because that's pretty much what I say. I try and be a little, no, if you've got the rapport, then I can be a bit cheeky about it. I can get away with it. That's typically how I just jump straight in with no messing around. But I'm sure it's probably not the best way, over the kind of multiple closes over multiple years. That's probably not the best strategy to use in all occasions.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, asking directly like that. So, and if you have the rapport, like you say, salespeople are easy to sell to. I think they're the easiest, right? So, but maybe in your case, what I would do is I would reframe what the benefit is that they're seeking. Why are they trying to be a sponsor, right? What's the outcome that they're seeking? And then I would make sure the scope of that is what they want. Even if you've already talked about it, we would review that. So that would, if you want to think of either a virtual agenda or an actual agenda, we would talk through that, make sure that the scope is what they want, and they're going to agree.
Sorry to interrupt. When you say scope, this is a word that's coming up more and more frequently on the podcast. So I don't know if it's like an industry popular word at the moment, but what do you mean by scope?
How big is it? How what kind of sponsorship? How many people are we going to reach? I mean, I'm assuming that there are dimensions to your project, right? That you've got, and the customer, in this case, a sponsor of some kind, has an objective of, so. I would want to match that. Is it doing everything that they want it to do? And so what we're trying to do is just match the solution to what their goal is.
Okay.
And so I would just spend a minute just reviewing that. And then once we've done that, then before you've had this call, you'll have written down on a piece of paper, right? Before we do any kind of close, it's important to have a couple of outcomes in mind. What do you want to have happen? And we want an ideal advance, right? So maybe in your case, this is the call. Or they're going to say, yes, let's move forward, right? You get a contract. Or maybe there's some other second step where we get some metrics back for them so they can understand what the upside is. And those might be alternate advances, right? And I would, when I'm using the term advance in the same way Neil Rackham does, just in case your audience isn't familiar with it, which is moving the sale forward in a little way, okay? Yeah. And that's the thing about the perfect close is we're either going to get a close or we're going to get an advance. That happens every time. Right, so it just continually moves towards closure. So with those things prepared, then we maybe review the scope with them real quick, and then we'll use the perfect close on them. And at that point, you're going to say, well, does it make sense for us to? And then you're going to use your ideal advance. So if that's wrapping it up, put a contract together, whatever, then that's what you're going to ask. So the first question of the perfect close is, does it make sense for us to X? And the X is whatever your ideal outcome is. And you got to think about it for a second, because there's a nuance to it. We're not saying, will you buy? Because that's not what the question is. The question is, does it make sense for us to, does it make sense for me to send you a contract? If they say yes, then great. We've telegraphed exactly what the next thing is, which is, okay, I'm going to send you a contract, right? Or if it's to schedule something, then okay, well, let's schedule it, right? So, but it really, at its core, it's a timing question. We're just asking, hey, is the time right for me to give you a contract, or is the time right for me to schedule an assessment for us to come see what the upside is for your organization? It's a timing question. And so there's really only two answers they're going to give us. Either yes, the timing is just fine, and they're going to move forward, and then we would just schedule it. Great, we only used one of the two questions. Or they would say no. And then if they say no, then you've got a couple of alternatives. And there are actually 5 variations of the perfect close. The kindergarten version is we would just throw the ball back to the customer then. We would just say, If they say, no, it doesn't make sense to do that, then we would just say, okay, what do you think is a good next step then? And so they're going to feed us what the next step is. So, and there's some benefits to the kindergarten version. If I have a brand new hire, I've just hired a rep, I could put them out there in the field without even really completely understanding what the customer, their buying process is, right? And the customer will essentially walk them through, because if they don't do good with their ideal and they throw it back to the customer and say, well, what do you think is a good next step? The customer kind of helps them go through the process. But you see how completely non-confrontational it is. We're just asking if the timing is right. The other variations are a little more sophisticated, and for your scenario that you gave me, I think would be more appropriate. So one's called the suggestion, which we would say, other clients at this stage tend to do Y. Does it make sense for us to do Y? And so we're help facilitating. And that's really important, especially in B2B, because a lot of times these customers invest in the thing that we're selling, some of them only once in a whole lifetime. So they really don't have a lot of experience in the buyer's journey, if you want to think about it that way. So us being able to tell them and help them say, other people tend to do it this way. Is that, it doesn't make sense for us to do that. Well, that's very facilitative. You're literally adding value to their process by making that suggestion, because you're more experienced at it. You do it every day, but they do it once in a lifetime, or maybe 5 times in a lifetime. It's like, so you're helping. So that's the suggestion, and then and you can do that as one of your fallbacks. For example, say, does it make sense for me to send you some paperwork or some contracts? And if they say no, then I could just say, well, other clients at this stage sometimes do this. Does it make sense for us to do that? That would be using one of your alternates. So, and the other way it works too. You can do it as an add-on. The key here is that we're just pacing at whatever the customer is ready for. The right close is the one that the customer is ready for, right? So, I had a client that we went and did we do IT software, and we did a demo at this healthcare organization in Sierra Vista, Arizona. And we thought we were demoing to the wrong people, which we were. So our ideal advance was to present to the right group of people. That was the ideal outcome. And then we had a couple of alternatives. And so we got down there, and it came time and said, hey, does it make sense for us to schedule a demo for these other guys? And he said, sure, absolutely. So I said, all right, we got one. So now we're going to do an add-on. We say, well, some other organizations, they'll actually have us get their data so we can look at doing a conversion for them. Does it make sense for us to get your data? And he said, yeah, absolutely. All right, check. We got number 2, right? So I said, well, sometimes, because it's a technical process, it makes sense for us to get our technical teams together. Does it make sense for us to schedule a time for our technical teams to talk? Guy says, yes, absolutely. Well, boom, I'm out of gas. All the things that I had prepared for, I got. So on the add-on, instead, with the fallback, you end with, what do you think is a good next step? With the add-on, you say, is there anything else we should be looking at right now? Something like that. And this guy says to me, our legal team is kind of slow. Could we get a copy of your contract or your agreement? And I'm like, well, of course, right? but I would have never guessed, because we were just presenting to the wrong set of people. I would have never dreamed that we could have gotten a contract for this guy. So, in fact, I would even argue that if we had made that our ideal advance and that was the first thing I asked, it probably would have come off wrong, right? But by pacing this thing at the rate this guy was ready for, he took us to a place that we would have never expected. So the takeaway from that is that we just want to pace it at whatever the customer is ready for. And sometimes they're ready to go faster than we anticipated, and sometimes they want to go a little slower. We just want to go at their rate. And then if ever there's a time, and I'm sidetracking here, but if there's a time where they can't, like, let's say I said, well, what do you think is a good next step? And they just sit there like a bump on a log. Well, that tells us something about this prospect, right? And how we should invest our time. So, I claim that you'll get 95% success with this thing. Either you're going to get a close or you're going to get an advance pretty much every single time you're with a person. But it doesn't matter how many times I present, somebody will say, well, what about that last 5%? Right? So you give them 95%, they want to know about the last 5%, right? So that 5% is an important 5%. It tells us how to invest our time, right? And so if we've got someone that can't come up with anything logical to advance this, then how strongly do they really want to achieve their outcome? And so that tells us, I'm not saying just dump them, but we need to really lower our priority in terms of how much time we're willing to invest in that kind of an account. Because as salespeople, time is the only thing we've got, right? So we need to invest it in the right places. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
that was fire. So I've been sat here making it hard for the audience who can't see this, half making notes, half just taking them on board, because what you just outlined is a very simple, and don't take this the wrong way, but a very simple process to put in place that takes a lot of the guesswork out of closing, takes a lot of the what I kind of try and do, which is seemingly now, having had this conversation, might be a bit of a backwards way of looking at it. I try and do a bit of like feeling out, and you can come in strong and have a bit of a laugh with the person. You can obviously immediately they either shut off or they just follow you, and you can lead them down the path of next actions until you send in an invoice or however it goes, however the final part of the close is. But what you just described was, and tell me if I'm wrong, but you're pre-framing each step, and you're giving them an option, and you're not forcing them to take the option, but you're allowing their brains to do the least possible processing and still come out with a next step. And clearly, our brains are designed to do as little work as possible to survive and to keep plodding along. Is that a way to describe it? I don't want to dumb down what you just described, but that's how, in real time as we're chatting, that's how it comes across to me.
No, you've nailed it. You've nailed it. That's exactly. And I would just add that think about how that feels to the customer as opposed to the other way, right? If I say, hey, will you buy my stuff? And let's just say that they say no, right? Well, where does that leave us? Emotionally, you're on much lower ground, right? But if I just said, hey, does it make sense for us to do this thing? And if they say no, we're still on much higher ground emotionally than the other way. So it's just vastly superior to every other method. I mean, and believe me, I have huge collections of all these closes. They all have names, and 95% of them are manipulative.
Yeah.
Some of them can work, right? Alternative choice close can work. I don't dispute that. But some people will feel manipulated when you say, hey, do you want 200 or 300? Right? I mean, it's a loaded question.
And let me just jump in, because that is a cliche example that has been used by used car salespeople for 30, 40 years. So even someone who doesn't know anything about selling, never mind a professional buyer, which what we might be kind of opposite while we're having this B2B discussion, the professional buyer is just going to have none of that. You're going to lose any respect that you've built at that point.
Right. In fact, that's the whole thing is, in fact, I had a client that, or I was a rep that I was coaching, and he called one of his clients and he asked in the wrong way. And I listened to the call. We were recording these calls later. And what I could tell happened was the customer felt like he was being manipulated. And so I could hear my rep just by the tone of the guy's voice. I could hear him go from here in respect all the way down to here. Once the guy had asked the question, he's like, oh, geez, am I really? I thought you were different than all the rest of these guys. And so it's just, it doesn't have to be that way. You can ask in a way that is absolutely zero pressure, and the customer will not because they wouldn't even be talking to you if they weren't trying to get somewhere, right? They're trying to achieve a goal, and you're trying to help them get the goal. So you're actually both aligned here. But there's nuances in navigating that path, and that's what that just asking for the next little step is, right? That gets us there. And by you just keep doing that each time at the pace the customer's ready for, you'll close a huge percentage of your opportunities, and or you'll weed out the ones that are bad targets.
Definitely.
That's the 5%.
Something that I want you to give us a little bit more clarity on, because I think it's worth diving into, because I never really do this. I'm all or nothing with these deals because I can be, because especially with the podcast sponsorship, with this kind of like live sponsorships and the I'm trying not to. I'll tell you about it when we start recording shortly. But all this other content that we're going to be putting out very shortly, which is super exciting, and that people are proactively reaching out to me. So I'm not being tested as a salesperson at the moment by closing these deals. Probably means I need to charge more for them. That's a story for another time. But one thing that I want to get more clarity on, because it's something that I don't do now because I don't have to do, and it's something that I've never done in the past because it's never been put across like how you described it, James, and that is having your alternatives. So when we've had negotiation experts come on the show, William Ury, a whole bunch of the top negotiation experts on George Siddell, the professors of negotiation from Harvard and all kinds of places, they always talk about this concept of BATNA, or your best alternative next action, or whatever the acronym comes to. So on the show, in context negotiations, we've always talked about having your next alternative. Whereas the close, I think I think there's a good chunk of the audience, I can speak on their behalf and say that they thought that this was binary. So I just want to drill down and clarify and double down on this for a second. What are some real practical examples of a next or an alternative when the prospect says, I'm not ready right now, or, this isn't quite the right time? What should be, in real practical terms, and you can use examples of yourself, or you can try and use an example of me selling ad space and sponsorship. What would be an alternative for me or yourself in one of these situations?
Okay, I can tell where you're going. So let me. A lot of salespeople aren't as familiar with the little steps that can take place in their sales cycle. Sometimes they're unconscious competent. The little steps exist, but if you say, hey, what are they? They can't articulate them. So in the book, we spend there's a chapter 8, where we're going to break those out. And that makes it a whole lot. And what there is you'll find there's a pattern. It doesn't matter what kind of sale you have. There's a pattern to these steps. And so by knowing them all, when you go in and plan, you think, okay, well, we could get this, we could get this. There's a whole lot of little steps on our way to the big step. Now, I will couch that by saying, if there are any listeners that essentially are in a one-call close, you can still use the perfect close, but it's really not quite as useful for you as it is for people in a complex sale where there might be 9 encounters all the way up until where we get the final big one, right? So it works either case, but the beauty of the perfect close is it continually advances the sale. So investing a little time in thinking about, all right, well, what are the little steps between here and there? That makes it easy for us to have either in our agenda or there's a planning form they can download off the website where they can plan exactly what these 3 alternatives are. And by the way, you're not limited to 3. You could, but I think if you keep falling back, more than 3 times, you're going to start sounding self-serving, right?
And is that happening because we're trying to progress things too fast and we haven't broken down this all enough?
Yeah. So the word there is too fast. Okay. So anytime we do something with a customer that they perceive as being too fast, that's when it starts to feel like manipulation to the customer. It's like when we're going faster than they're ready for, that feels like manipulation. And it doesn't matter what method you're using. When you do that, they feel like they're manipulated, even if that's not your intent. So that's why I just ask him if, does it make sense for us to, whatever it is, the timing wise, well, it never feels like we're manipulating because we're not saying do this. We're just saying, is it right? And if they say no, well, then we just back off to one of these other ones that we've prepared. So I don't know. Did that help?
Yeah. And I want to go a step further and then we'll wrap up the show with this. Again, hopefully these deals come off, otherwise I'm going to look like a right idiot when next time you come on the show and you ask me about this. But maybe I'm overestimating the value that I'm giving in these deals. But the ad sponsorship deal for these events that we're doing, for example, to just stay on this, and I want to get real practical with it. If I ask the question and they come back and they say, live over the phone, and they say, we're not ready for this right now, what should be the next step? Or what was the step prior that I didn't confirm with them before moving on, if that makes sense? If I'm consciously competent or unconsciously competent, or however you described it, I thought I've done all these steps, but what was the one I've missed out on if I've asked for the business at that point?
You can miss, right? So just because you planned it all out doesn't mean it's going to happen every time. So for all you know, like I've gone into opportunities where everything looked great, and then the morning we got there for our final presentation, they had just announced publicly that this company was being acquired by another company and that there was going to be layoffs. Guess what? All of our planning up to that point just changed, right? Because the environment changed for our clients. So that would change it, right? What seemed like a logical, hey, let's consummate this deal here, might turn into, okay, well, now there's other players that we're going to have to involve in the deal. So just using your example, we would just use the kindergarten version. So, well, what's a good next step then? We just want to pace it at what's ready for them. So if their world has changed, then we just kind of want to get behind, all right, well, tell me what it is that's changed and how I can help you. So again, you're just a facilitator. And it's when people start to lean into it a little bit, that's when they're starting to, that's when it starts to feel manipulative to the customer. And what I can tell you, I've been on ride-alongs with reps, brand new reps, And what happens 90% of the time is the customer offers you a very logical next step. Okay. And then in a small percentage, they can't come up with anything. And then it tells us a little bit about where these guys are at in terms of their goals, right? Ideally, we can identify them before we ever get out there with our targeting. But if we happen to end up in front of somebody who's not a good target, and then we ask them what a good next step is, and they can't come up with anything, all right, well, then something went wrong or something changed between when we started the sale and now.
Love it. I love the fact that this is real time. I love the fact that it takes away the binary element of it. I love that it puts, I don't know whether you call it control or perceived control. I don't know in the customer's mind.
The customer, they feel like they're in control of the whole process. They love it.
But you're so what I mean. So whether they are actually in control because you are, you're trying to get that next step, or get rid of them out of your pipeline if they're not suitable. So whether it's perceived control or control, I guess it doesn't really matter. That's just linguistics at that point. But I love the fact that it's real time as well. I love that it's reactionary. I love that you're not, if you go all in and you say, this is the deal, and use a weird, it's probably got a name, but I've seen other people use it, especially in the world of like car sales and that kind of thing. And you say, that's the price for the next 12 hours. If you don't buy it, the price is going to change. When you use things of that nature, you don't know that, as you said, the company's just been acquired. So they need another week of processing to get it all sorted. But now they've got twice the budget and twice the scope. What you're suggesting and the way you go about things, James, in your framework, is that you're allowing that into the mix. And obviously in the longer B2B complex sales, that is exactly what it needs. So I appreciate all that, mate. And just to wrap up, I've got one final question to ask everyone that comes on the show. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what's the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Oh, hands down, intent matters more than technique. If I went back in time, I would tell myself, just get off of yourself for a minute and what you're going to get out of it for a minute. Just get that. Get present with the customer. See how you can help these guys. If you end up helping these guys, you'll be taken care of. I spent years trying to really, I wanted to be the guy. I wanted to be, recognized that I had, the juice by other people. And so I spent a lot of time. And then, but years later, I figured out, if I just help these guys, I'll get what I want. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. And once I finally came to that, not only was I making more money, but I also was much happier with the whole process. And my clients all turned into friends, which are still friends today. And that has ramifications because I've been in the healthcare space for 30 years. So I've sold several people multiple times, in all those years, just because they go and they move to another organization and then they call me back. And so, but that doesn't happen when you manipulate people, right? You don't get those callbacks. So it doesn't turn into a career type of thing. So yeah, absolutely. Just intent matters more than technique. Get your head in the right place. Just actually be present with them and try to help. That would be what I would have saved myself probably 3 years worth of frustrated work there.
So I had this with the podcast. When I first started, I thought I was giving everything to the guests that come on the show, and I thought I was really helping them out, and I'd promote the books on social media and all this kind of stuff. And I think it was Jim Cathcart came on, and he really drilled into me a number, just through our conversation, not through any extra coaching or anything. Just I got so much out that recording the episode with him, the first one we did, and he really changed. It was a light bulb moment for me. It was a switch that came on that was forget about, and it sounds so cliche and it sounds so like airy fairy and hippie, but if you take the money, the cash, everything off the table that you're obviously aiming towards, I don't think there's many salespeople who do it just because they love selling, but that's obviously a motivator. But when you take all that off the table and you focus on the people and the relationships and adding value to them, that comes way quicker than that you're just focused on just screwing every single person down to that last dollar and cent. And it's something that I intellectualized but didn't put into practice and didn't know on that, didn't put into practice. That's the best way to describe it until, months and months after. So let me ask you this, James, how did you make that transition and understand this? Was it something that happened? Was it something that someone said? Or was it, a longer, slower process of just experience in the industry?
Oh, no, it was a person. So I picked up a book. This is during the internet age, right? When the internet was all hot. called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play. And the author is Mahang Khalsa is the name of the author. And it had a brown, looked like almost like a brown paper bag type of wrapper on it, and very unassuming. But in the book, he teaches many of these principles. And by the way, anybody to B2B, I would highly recommend the book. It is fantastic. But in there, he says it a little differently than I do. But basically, he says, intent matters more than technique does. And so he probably that changed my thinking. It changed my thinking from, instead of getting in there where my intent was to get their money, I changed to, I'm just trying to help these guys out. And I highly recommend the book, but that's actually the guy who's responsible for having turned my head around. And my book is actually dedicated to him for that reason.
Amazing. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes. And then with that, you teed it up perfectly. James, tell us a little bit about your book and where we can find it.
Well, I think we've already covered a lot of it. It's basically the best practice in sales closing. It's 2 questions, 95% effective. We hit bestseller status back in September, and if they want to find it, they can just get it on Amazon.com. Just type in closed sales, and it'll be the first thing that shows up on the top of the list there. Or they can go to my website if they want to just check it out as a preview first. They can download the first 3 chapters, which is a lot of the book. I just want to make sure that it's their cup of tea before they invest in a book. And then there's also a special report there that they can get to. The website is puremuir.com, PUREMUIR.com. Again, there's a ton of resources on there. Just go to the resources page, and that's where you'll find the preview of the book, as well as the 7 deadly myths of sales closing, and a bunch of forms and stuff that they can use for their closing process. So
good stuff. Well, I'll link to all that in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.red. And with that, James, I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for pretty much turning closing on its head with our conversation today. And what I will do as well, I will experiment with this as I said, I'm probably not the best case scenario for a lot of this, because the deals come to me versus me having to be putting this into a scenario where it would be tested rigorously. But I'm going to test it, and then we're going to have you back on the show in the not too distant future, and we can discuss some thoughts and feedback of my experience of it as well. So I appreciate that, mate. I appreciate that it's so applicable. I appreciate you've laid it out for us. I appreciate that you've just shared the secrets of closing with us. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Will. It was great being on.